we had Soviet fighters, MiG-29s, sitting on our dispersal right outside the squadron. It was the weirdest thing, from being under this continual state of tension to suddenly be drinking with these Soviet pilots in our bar.
Welcome to Cold War Conversations.
5, 6, 7, 8, 8, 3. Good evening. The stunning overthrow of Mikhail Gorbachev by communist hardliners dominates the news this Monday. Gorbachev was reported under house arrest as Soviet tanks took up positions throughout Moscow.
And I'm here to host this final program from the German Democratic Republic.
In this episode, we welcome back Nick Anderson, who told us about his RAF service intercepting Tu-95 Soviet Bear bombers over the North Sea. The story continues with his accounts of how the Soviet aircrew tried to distract RAF planes and how he was almost downed by their tactics. We end the episode with Nick telling us about the final days of the Cold War. Now, I know you're tempted to skip this next bit, but before we start, I'd like to thank all our listeners who are supporting the podcast with their donations. From as little as £1, $1 or a ruble, they are all helping keep us on the air, as well as expanding the show. Hopefully you'll have noticed our new theme music, which has been directly funded by those listeners. If you want to learn more, just head over to coldwarconversations.com and click on the support the podcast menu option to learn more. If that's not your cup of tea, then you can also help us by leaving a review in iTunes or with your favourite podcast provider. So, back to today's episode. We join my Cold War conversation with Nick Anderson chasing bears. When you're taking photographs of these planes, how would the Soviet air crews react?
They would certainly interact with us. I mean, we were 10 or 15 feet away from them, and we'd often wave at them and gesticulate. And but we'd be escorting these guys for hours on end, and it did get a little bit boring. They'd disappear off to their galley and come back with a plate of food, knowing very well that we had nothing on board to eat. So they would often wave a chicken leg at us and perhaps toast us with a mug of something which we assumed was vodka, probably wasn't. So that was all part of the game, I think. Sometimes we'd meet an aircraft where the crew wouldn't react at all to us. They just stared straight ahead. We often wondered if perhaps they had one of their political commissaires on board those. I don't know. But, while they were just on a straightforward transit, and a lot of them were just transiting through our airspace, and we were just, there monitoring them. They weren't always on operational missions. It could be a very long and tedious mission for both of us. We very rarely saw the pilots. It was very hard to get close to the front of the airplane because of those enormous damn props that were whirring around. So you could see the guys, from a wingtip, and you couldn't really tell their expressions. The guys we tended to see most of the time were the chaps that sat around the two rear glazed blisters that were at the back of the Bear. They were usually the gunners, or I don't know what other functions. Perhaps the navigators used to wander down, take a look at us. At the back there were also a pair of big cannons, radar guided. They often used to lock the radar to us, but the guns always stayed centered and pointing up into the sky, indicating that they weren't going to be aggressive with them.
Right.
And we always went through a very strict set of safety checks at 10 miles when we were completing the intercept, just to confirm that there was no way we were going to accidentally release a weapon. Because, I mean, I don't know if people realize anymore how close at times we were to having a conflict, and how important it was for us to make sure that we weren't accidentally the blokes that started World War III. And bearing in mind that when I first intercepted a bear, I was 24 years old, and we were often completely out of radio contact with any of our controlling agencies because we were so far from the UK. It was quite a responsible job, considering the Cold War was, still at its peak.
Yeah, no, I was going to ask you about that because, I mean, how would a missile be launched? Presumably there's various safety switches you've got to turn or things like that, or is it just press a button?
It's a surprisingly simple thing. If you're on a normal mission, we would have the missile stations would simulate there was a real missile on. So all the indications in the cockpit were that there was a real missile there. We would have a seeker head mounted onto a sort of concrete body for the missile, for the heat-seeking missile. So you can actually lock the seeker head on to a target. And every time we completed an intercept, we put the master arm on and pulled the trigger, which is what you did to fire a missile. I mean, there's a vaguely amusing story, amusing, I guess, because no one was killed, of a poor chap. He was one of my instructors when I went through the Phantom OCU, who was flying an aircraft in Germany on an exercise, and they had a mix of armed and unarmed aircraft. And he rolled in behind a Jaguar, and forgetting that he was in an armed aircraft, he put the master arm on and fired a live missile at this Jaguar and shot him down. Now, very luckily, the Jag pilot got out. He was actually in the instrument pattern for Bruggen. And there was a great big bang behind him, and the controls all went floppy, and his airplane started to glow red as the back end was on fire, and he just ejected quite safely. But, the difference between an aircraft with real missiles on an aircraft with simulated missiles on, there was no difference. So there was very little way to tell. And once you're in a habit pattern, in the heat of the moment, it's very easy to fall back into an old way of doing things. It was almost like a robotic response. So when we were on QRA with live missiles, we had big white tape stuck over the master arm, and the navigator was supposed to pull the trigger circuit breaker to deactivate the trigger, so there was no way we could accidentally fire. But having gone through all the safety checks, there was very little chance we were accidentally going to fire a missile. But on cue, you were very aware that you're in a fully armed airplane. The chances of you forgetting were pretty remote. So I don't think there was much chance of us. There was the odd incident. I mean, the Russians would, I say Russians, they were Soviets, would try to deliberately spoil our day, if I could put it in inverted commas. They would frequently at night and at low level, while we were formating on them, use very bright signal lamps to shone directly into the cockpit to blind us. They would sometimes fire signal flares at us. I was formating on a guy who started a gentle spiraling descent towards the ocean and then went slower and slower until I nearly stalled the aircraft, and only recovered by going underneath him in full burner, trying to get airspeed back very close to the water at night with the Radalt warning shouting at me because I'd allowed myself to get into that difficult situation. Partly my fault. Well, in fact, partly my fault, mainly his, the Soviets, but they weren't always as friendly as I paint. So they would definitely try and shake you off so they could get on with whatever operational task they were trying to accomplish without having you around. And, of course, nowadays you see both sides complaining bitterly that they're being intercepted and aircraft getting too close to them. Well, I tell you, if there had been as many cameras around when I was doing my flying and access to the internet as there are nowadays, that you would make these modern photographs look quite tame.
Yeah, I mean, I was amazed when you said that, you were like 10 feet away from the wingtip, which sounds very close.
Well, if the guy's in cloud, then, you have to be very close to continue to see him. We tell the truth, we didn't often formate on the wingtip because if the guy rolled, that thing moves at quite a rate. So we'd often formate on the back end of the airplane, the tailplane, which was much easier to see. But it meant that we were very close to the fuselage. You've seen the Top Gun movie with our hero flying upside down over an aircraft. It's times you'd have to do that so the nav could get a picture of the top of the fuselage. We would roll over the top of a bear, and I've done it. Just to, there's a new aerial. Let's see if we can get a picture of that. So you do a quick barrel roll over the top, and then you can take a picture of the top of our canopy, of the top of their bear. Not something we did all the time, but, if needs must. One of our other squadron companions famously tried to photograph up inside the dispensing bay of one of these bears who was throwing out sonar buoys. And the guy fired a sonar buoy which hit the Phantom, bounced off the fuselage and got tangled up in the fin. And I think it was Dave Word, lovely guy, Pekka, who then thought, this is interesting. I've got one of these sonar buoys hanging off the back end of my airplane. I wonder if I can take it home. And he tried to take this thing all the way back to Lucas, but sadly the sort of nylon stringers of the drogue that this sonar buoy deployed that tangled up in his tail wore through, and it fell off before he got home. But I mean, it was there weren't that many rules, quite honestly. We weren't given any real indications of what to do and what not to do. We were there to do a job, and we certainly made sure that our presence was felt. And it wasn't just bears we intercepted. We used to sometimes intercept badgers and bison and coots, all either maritime E-Lint aircraft or bombers. And sometimes we'd launch for the new backfires that they'd built, but we never actually got as far as intercepting them. They always turned back, certainly in my time. I don't know since then. But
and what's the closest they got to when you would have had to warn them off and say no further?
Well, the closest they could really come was just a handful of miles from our coast. So, you can't claim airspace that is not over your coast or within your within your legal waters. So I think it's 12 miles, as I recall. We would start. But if they'd come that close, we would have made a much bigger presence. We'd have probably launched a few more aircraft, and they didn't. They occasionally came down amongst the Northern Isles, but quite honestly, they've been a lot more aggressive recently with their forays down the English Channel, which have upset civil air traffic considerably. No, we met them usually out a long way from the UK, with nothing but hundreds of miles of ocean around us, just us and the Soviets doing our thing. And we of course, they're in international waters out there, so there's nothing that we would do. And even if they decided they were going to fly across the UK, I don't think that was sufficient grounds to shoot them down. Unless the government had suddenly decided that they wanted to make a point. The Soviets shot down, remember that Korean 747? They mistook,
KAL 007.
That's the one. They thought, in inverted commas, it was an American spy plane and decided to shoot it down. The fact that it was obviously a civil airliner didn't seem to matter to them. So they weren't well, they'd done some things like that and gone down very badly. I think if we'd done something in reverse, we'd have lost the moral high ground. I think there's any point in starting a war over one intercept that goes on and carries on over the UK.
Well, and also a misidentification, because, I mean, wasn't there that case with the USS Vincennes in the Gulf where they shot down an Iranian Airbus?
That's right, thinking it was an F-14, an Iranian F-14.
Yeah.
Yes, and these things happen, and they just leave a bitter taste in your mouth because you think to yourself, you can only take a defense of your position so far, and then you realize that, no, you can't take the risk of killing hundreds of people, innocent civilians, by overstepping the mark, as it were. And all that's a matter of judgment, and I'm not going to say that they were wrong in doing that, but I think we took a very careful view towards the possibility of starting the next war, because quite honestly, it was the only thing that was on our minds at that point. It was an all-encompassing threat, and the entire of the Air Force's resources were aimed at controlling or trying to control the Soviet threat should they decide to attack the West.
Yeah. Because I remember, I think in the 80s, there was a Soviet jet that got into trouble over East Germany, and the pilot ejected, and the plane didn't come down in East Germany and continued into NATO airspace. I think it ended up coming down in Belgium.
Interesting. I know there were a few defections as well. I don't know if there are many over Germany, but certainly there was a Foxbat in Japan that a chap defected and took his MiG-25 from Soviet airspace and landed it in Japan. And he remained there. Then the aircraft was stripped down by the Americans and returned to the Soviets some weeks later in a number of packing cases. So these things did happen. And it was all, a case of tit for tat. We were always trying to get an edge. You've talked about Bricksmiths and the amazing job that our guys did trying to keep an eye on new Soviet equipment, including flying little chipmunks out of Gatow in Berlin, photographing, and the Pembrokes that used to go up and down the Berlin air corridors, photographing equipment whenever they could. That was a remarkable thing, just trying to keep an eye on what was going on. It was anything we could do to get an edge over the Soviet advancements. But it was a weird thing for me because, I spent 2 and a bit tours doing nothing but monitoring that airspace and doing all the other jobs that we did in the Phantom. And then I was lucky enough to get an exchange job with the Australian Air Force, flying F-18s. Now, that was a fantastic opportunity. I loved it. And when I came back, the Cold War was more or less over. The wall had come down. And I remember I was posted back to my old base, RAF Lucas in Scotland, this time on Treble 1 Squadron. And we were restarting the squadron with brand new ADV, Air Defense Variant Tornadoes, the F3. And we had an air show annually. And the first air show we had Soviet fighters, MiG-29s, sitting on our dispersal right outside the squadron. And we were crawling all over these airplanes. These were airplanes that we had only ever really seen in grainy black and white pictures. And we had our best guess at their performance capabilities in top secret manuals in our squadrons. But here we were climbing over them. It was the weirdest thing to, from being under this continual state of tension to suddenly be drinking with these Soviet pilots in our bar. We couldn't do much other than toast each other and drink lots because we couldn't understand a word they were saying, and pretty much vice versa. But that for me was the funniest, strangest thing that I've probably ever experienced in my life.
I was gonna ask you about that because I was aware you were around at the end of the Cold War, and I was going to ask you if you'd met any Soviet aircrew. I mean, that must have been. I'll have to see if I can find some photos of those MiG-29s on the base.
Yeah, I've got some. I took pictures of both the aircraft and their transport, and I've even got a picture inside the cockpit of these things. And we swapped badges. I mean, these guys came across from a country that was pretty much bankrupt, and they've been given a tiny amount of sort of pocket money. So the base was providing them with free accommodation, and we were basically buying them drinks all night. And in thanks, they were tearing off the badges from their flying suits to give to us. So I've got one of these Soviet pilots' badges, and I still look at that and think that was a weird time. You do share a certain camaraderie with someone, regardless of the fact he might be a potential enemy, because you're doing the same sort of job. You're both in the military. You both have the potential to kill or be killed. That's what it's all about. So you do share that element of being both in the profession of arms, which creates a certain amount of camaraderie. Not that I think either of us would have ever balked at the fact that we would, one day perhaps pull the trigger on each other. That didn't really, you never stop to think twice before doing that if you had to. But the fact that we were toasting these guys and trying to learn Russian toasts and, playing silly games in the mess, I thought that was brilliant. Apart from the fact it was a great relief, because for years we'd been under this threat, and all of a sudden it seemed to have disappeared nearly overnight.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And did you let them look at your aircraft as well in the same way that you were able to look over the MiG-29s?
I am not sure. I never showed anyone around of one of our aircraft, but it wouldn't have surprised me if they had been allowed. Mind you, not that there was any great secrets in the F3 Tornado. It was not my favorite airplane, and was how do I put this politely? It wasn't exactly considered a top-notch fighter. It was a fine interceptor. And you can't gain too much intelligence from just looking at a bunch of switches. You really do need to know all the technical background of frequencies and PRFs and, carrier wave frequencies and missile range and motor burn lengths. All those kind of things are the things that give you a tactical edge. Just looking inside the cockpit usually doesn't do much.
And you'd only know that from flying one, I presume.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And of course, as soon as we could, NATO got hold of all the East German fighters and promptly started flying them around, trying to work out, what we could do if we ended up fighting the Russians, who on other countries who had these airplanes, since East Germany was now on our side, as it were. So I think there was a lot of intelligence gained after the wall came down and these aircraft were made available. But the Americans were pretty good at getting hold of Soviet equipment from all sorts of places. And they used to have a little base in America. I say a little. There was a base in America where a lot of these aircraft were kept and were flown in combat with against American aircraft, so that they knew just who would be the winner come the real day.
Yeah, because the MiG-29 was the only Soviet aircraft that I think the Luftwaffe took on after reunification, wasn't it?
Well, it's a pretty impressive airplane. I'm trying to think of the name of the formation team that came across with these airplanes, but they transited across from Moscow unrefueled, so no air-to-air refueling. They did a couple of displays over the base and then promptly told everyone they were still a bit heavy to land. So they went off into the local area and did aerobatics and stuff for another half an hour until they said, "They're okay, we're lighting up." And we looked at them and went, "How the hell have they done that? What kind of range do these airplanes have?" So we were quite taken aback with the quality of their performance. When you looked at the airframes, they were still built in that same rather crude way that the Soviets did. Everything was a bit bashed up, the rivet heads, and it all looked a little bit
tired.
Yeah, well, not so much tired, it's just badly put together, quite honestly. But the fact was, it didn't really matter whether all the seams were perfectly straight. If it got to the fight and fired a decent missile and shot you down, well,
that's pretty irrelevant.
Does it really matter? Exactly. Yes,
and
exactly.
So at the end of the Cold War, you were still operational. Did you serve in the Gulf War?
I had decided that I was going to retire at the end of my flight commander tour with Treble 1 Squadron on the Tornado. I was a bit disillusioned with the Tornado, to be absolutely plain. I'd come back from the Australian Air Force where they flew F-18s, and I'd had a marvelous 3 years on that machine. And when I came back in and experienced the F-3, I was, to say I was disappointed is probably an exaggeration. I was dismayed. So I thought, well, I'm getting on a bit. I've done this job for quite a few years now. Probably time for me to go. I wasn't terribly keen to try and progress up the slippery pole and get myself promoted, inevitably up to desk jobs. So I decided if I was going to continue to use my skill as a pilot, I would need to move on to a different kind of flying job. So, yeah, I decided to come out, and having made that decision, I was basically waiting out my last year, and the Gulf War started. So, that was it. I left halfway through the first Gulf War, which actually made getting a job in Civvy Street pretty damn hard, because the airline industry took an enormous hit during the Gulf War with lack of confidence in flying, and very few airlines were recruiting. Dan Air had gone bust, and there were a lot of pilots kicking around with no jobs. So it was a bit of a difficult time just for a while, but eventually I got a job with a decent airline, and I haven't really looked back, certainly from a flying point of view. I mean, I enjoyed my time, don't get me wrong. I had 19 years in the Air Force, from a very young man up to quite a mature chap, and left just before I needed reading glasses. So I thought that was a fine time to leave.
And I understand at the moment you're still an airline pilot. I mean, it must be interesting in terms of, you've flown fast jets and now you're flying an airliner. And you'll probably hate this comparison, but it must be a bit like driving a bus versus driving a sports car.
Oh, that's exactly what it is. But I mean, I think everyone who drives a fast car must realize that as they get on in life, their reflexes are not going to be as good, and they're not going to push it quite as hard as they used to. So they're never going to be quite as effective as they were when they were a young man. It's definitely a young man's job, that sort of thing. I know the F-18 could sustain 7.8 G or almost as long as it had fuel. And I was in my, mid to late 30s when I was flying that. And that was a hard work job if you were going to, fight some of the young guys who spent all day in the gym. About the only exercise I did was lifting my pint at the end of the day. I had to use all the tricks I had up my sleeve to defeat some of these youngsters. So, yeah, I saw the writing on the wall. I mean, it's fun flying these airplanes, fantastic fun. But, being an airline pilot is not really, there's not a lot of flying skill required. Everything you do requires only a basic level of skill. What you are more is a people and person manager. You're looking after a small village that's being taken halfway around the world. You've got hundreds of people under your care, and that is a high level of responsibility. So yes, it's much more a strategic job than it is the sort of dynamic flying you get in the Air Force. But having said that, it does have its own level of reward, both professionally as well as financially. So it's not a bad profession at all, and I thank everybody and everything that has given me an opportunity to fly right up to the point of retirement. And when I go in 5 months, 6 months' time, it'll have been 45 years of professional flying. I just love the fact that I've been able to do it so long, and I've enjoyed every moment.
How many hours of flying is that? Do you know?
You know what? Between you, me, and the fence post, I stopped counting a long time ago. I'm sure the CAA will be phoning me up tomorrow morning going, Mr. Anderson, we'd like to see your logbook.
It's all right. I can delay this going out for 6 months.
But seriously, it no longer becomes important. I mean, my father was an airline pilot, flew over 30,000 hours. But with the hours restrictions, because we're a little bit more attuned to levels of fatigue, I would have guessed around 20,000, 25,000, somewhere around there. But not absolutely sure, I'm afraid.
Well, Nick, it's been fantastic talking to you. I really appreciate what you shared with us. You have your own podcast. Can you tell our listeners where they can find more about you?
Oh, sure. I wish I could lay claim to it, but the lovely Captain Jeff started it off many years ago, and I'm just one of his co-hosts. The podcast's called The Airline Pilot Guy, and you can find us on any decent podcast catching app, or we've got a lovely website at airlinepilotguide.com. But my little treasure in that show, apart from being a co-host, is to do my own little historic piece called Plain Tales, and they're just short little stories taken from all aspects of flying, both up to date and quite historic, personal recollections, stories of old, and accidents, and anything that sort of features and tickles my fancy from an aviation point of view. And that is part of the show, but there is a separate feed you can find on our website, and those are called Plain Tales.
And there's some great Cold War stories on there. I mean, the one that I was immediately attracted to was the Bricksmiths one about the Chipmunk flights. And
I know. I hadn't heard about that. I found out about that by accident. And I was immediately taken by the fact that we used to have a spy plane and it was a Chipmunk. Isn't that wonderful?
Well, I was intrigued by the odd bullet hole that they ended up with as well. And
yes, I often wonder how accurate those claims were, because they're still quite tight-mouthed about what they got up to and things. But yes, I've certainly seen pictures that they took of Soviet soldiers on the ground aiming their weapons at them. So it wouldn't surprise me at all.
Yeah. Well, Nick, thank you. I've taken enough of your time this evening, but really appreciate your time. That was really interesting.
I'm very glad you enjoyed it, and the pleasure has been all mine. It's an absolute delight, and I wish you well with this fantastic podcast.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. And I wish you the same with Plain Tales as well. Well, that's it for today's episode. Don't forget to visit the show notes at coldwarconversations.com, where there's further details of this week's episode and photos of those MiG-29s at Nick's RAF base. If you can't wait for our next episode, do visit our Facebook discussion group, where our guests and listeners, just like you, continue the Cold War conversation. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. We're also keen to chat with you on Twitter. Our handle on there is @ColdWarPod, and we're also on Instagram @ColdWarConversations. Thank you very much for listening. It's really appreciated. Goodbye.